Good afternoon. I'm Jon Meacham, the co-chair of the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy. Thank you all for joining us for what I think will be an important and, if we do our job right, illuminating conversation about the expulsion of two Tennessee legislators and what that tells us about the unfolding crisis in democratic institutions in the United States, and insofar as that tells us something about what's unfolding around the world. Before we begin, I think we should take a moment to acknowledge the loss of the victims of the shooting at Covenant School here in Nashville. Also, tragically, the violence that unfolded in Louisville, Kentucky, not far from us this week. And in fact, all of the people who have been lost to gun violence, which is now the leading cause of death among American children, according to statistics, a remarkable and tragic state of affairs that is at the heart of what unfolded here in Tennessee over the past couple of weeks. So we remember the human cost, the human face of this as we move into the broader political questions. I'm honored to be joined by my friend Forrest Harris, who is the president of American Baptist College, the Holy Hill, as we call it, as it's long been called, the alma mater of C.T. Vivian and John Lewis and James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette. I think American Baptist College has the highest percentage of winners of the Presidential Medal of Freedom relative to their student population. Forrest is also, of course, on the Vanderbilt Divinity School faculty and director of the Kelly Miller Smith Institute and a member of the advisory board of the Project on Unity and American Democracy. And he's my friend, so but don't hold the last part against him because that could be okay. That could be ugly. And I'm going to butcher so I'm going to use my free speech, Jacob, to butcher your last name. This is Jacob
Mchangama,
who is a formidable addition to Vanderbilt. He leads the Future of Free Speech Project. He is a research professor here at Vanderbilt. He kindly came and spoke to a class that John Geer and I teach a week or two ago, and they're still clapping over in the classroom. So we're delighted. And my colleague and friend, Bruce Oppenheimer, has lost his internet. We think it might be either a Russian or House Republican operation. Bruce may pop up here in a moment, and if so, we will bring him in. Thank you to this group for juggling their schedules. My friend and colleague, the director of the project, Grace Sasser, and his team have spent an enormous amount of time trying to get lots of folks balanced out here in this busy week, and so we're hugely grateful for that. We have some online questions we'll get from, we will read from you all in a little bit. Forrest, let's start. Talk about this decision of the Tennessee House to expel the two members. One member was saved by a single vote. Both members have now been sent back to the legislature by the governing bodies of their constituencies. But set the scene for us here. What are the forces that led to the expulsion? And in your mind, is there any precedent for this?
Yeah, thank you, John. So glad to be a part of this conversation. There's no question that this is a historic moment of expulsion from a legislative body. In the process of these two representatives joining the protests for better gun laws, red flag provisions, to get these assault weapons out of our communities or limit it to the point wherein children can go to school safe. Nashville, Louisville, around the country, there is a gaping wound that is deepened and broadened by the action of the Tennessee state legislatures by expelling these two African-American men who joined the protest and, according to state house decorum rules, broke those rules and were expelled for that. But I think something is larger at work. This is the first time since the historic civil rights movement, of which Nashville was a part, that this kind of moment has resurfaced to give energy to a national movement again, and this time around gun control and laws that will make Americans safe. The thing I think that drove the Tennessee legislature to the decision to expel them had to do with at least two or three things. One, I think it racialized the forces of protest again around Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. It racialized them around the fear of Afrophobia. Then secondly, they exhibited a kind of anti-democratic authoritarianism that really gave some sense of fascism and power, raw use of power, not given attention to the trauma, the gaping wound and hurt and victims and children being killed by these weapons. And I think that gave rise to their thinking that they needed to expel these two African-Americans, men, talented youth, zeal, the kind of youth and zeal and passion for justice that John Lewis and others at the time in the 1960s displayed. And now we are pushed nationally to rethink what it means for these assemblies to have this kind of raw power and an exercise of it without due diligence. And thank God that they have been reinstated by their local governments to come back to the House. And of course, a special runoff election will occur. So one last point that I think sets the context for why they were expelled. There was in the Tennessee State House Assembly a kind of toxic masculinity, a toxic white masculinity that continues to seek power to dominate, give a kind of authoritarian dominance of who and how people can stand for, be a part of advocating for change and freedom. And that toxic white male masculinity in the supermajority of the Republican Party in the State House was on display during this period. That's the context as I see it, John.
Thanks, Forrest. Jacob, put this in a global context for us. You are new to Tennessee. I suspect having a local example, a zip code or two over of a legislative body expelling dissidents probably reminds you of other parts of the world. Put this moment in a global context for us.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a newcomer to Tennessee and not familiar with local politics. So I'll be careful about my comments on what actually transpired there. But it's, of course, peaceful protest is a key element of democracy and how you achieve change. So we've seen that when it comes to expanding the franchise to women, to the property laws, to countering racial and religious discrimination, and toppling even authoritarian governments, as take the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, these popular movements that overthrew communism, for instance. And so you might say that the expulsion in this case is a little bit different in the sense that these were not, these were not protesters out in the streets. This took place in a state legislature, and as I understand it, the rules were breached. But it seems to me that the reaction was one that was disproportionate, and that when you had a supermajority, it was an exercise of powers that was not commensurate with what had actually taken place. I also, as I noted, the protest did not result in any arrests, so it was not as such, an attempt to sort of disrupt the peaceful transfer of power, as we've seen in other instances in this country where legislatures have been disrupted. And I think it comes at an unfortunate time. So I've long advocated that we live through a period in time where we have a free speech recession, and around the world you also see that when it comes to protest, increasingly countries around the world crack down on protest. This is most obvious in authoritarian states. So the brave women in Iran, protesters in Myanmar, but we also see it in democracies. So my own home country, Denmark, for instance, during COVID protests, we had protesters that burned in effigy a doll of our prime minister. They were arrested and put in prison on remand for, I think, 3 to 4 weeks on charges of wanting to overthrow the government. And finally, they were acquitted by a court. But I think that sent sort of a chilling signal to protesters. We've seen also in a number of European countries that protesters who were sort of protesting against China during Chinese state visits were systematically censored. So I think that it's part of a larger picture of this erosion of important democratic norms. And some of those norms are sort of legally or constitutionally entrenched. In this case, it seems more as not abiding by the underlying norms and commitment to sort of the culture of democracy and tolerance that is also necessary for proper democracy to function. So it might be that the majority in this case was entitled to make the decision, the expulsion, but a democracy also depends on a commitment to tolerance and not sort of using the most extreme measures at hand when you're a majority and want to use it along strict partisan lines. So that would sort of be my initial comments on how I see it.
Expand, if you would, on the free speech recession.
Yeah, so you can see that in a lot of ways. So, well, if you take sort of a long-term view, you could argue that we live through a golden age of free speech. Free speech is facilitated through communications technology. It's constitutionally enshrined in human rights law. But if you and you had the third wave of democratization that brought democracy since sort of the 70s to a lot of new countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern and Central Europe. But from around the beginning of this new millennia, we've actually seen a reversal. So democracies are in decline, especially liberal democracy, and free speech, you will see, and its sort of related values of freedom of assembly and association will very often, in fact, almost always be the first rights that would be authoritarians or liberal rulers will target, because you depend on controlling the public sphere. And so there are different sort of approaches to this. If you're China, you will go to extremely draconian means. If you're Viktor Orban in Hungary, you will employ more clever means of undermining pluralism of media, undermining democratic institutions, and so on. But all of that, unfortunately, goes in a direction of undermining free speech, which without free speech, there's really no functioning pluralism. So it's part and parcel of democracy. I would say that, though, populists, illiberals, authoritarians play a part in this, but unfortunately, those who want to fight to keep democracy alive also, I think, have a tendency to react with laws that undermine free speech, and saying that this is necessary in order to save free speech. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle, and that's why sort of we're interested in researching the extent and most importantly how to counter it.
So historically speaking, I'll just say as an anecdotal matter, when this unfolded over the past days, my mind went back to two things. One, the violence that unfolded. Our friend and colleague Joanne Friedman at Yale has written about of violence in the Congress of the United States in the antebellum period. The most notable instance being Preston Brooks of South Carolina nearly beating Charles Sumner of Massachusetts to death, and being celebrated for it, receiving gifts of canes, and being elevated as a hero of the white South and the slaveocracy in the 1850s. And the other, which is less well known, was in the 1920s, amid the fears that the Bolshevik Revolution was going to be exporting socialism. The attempts in not in the South, but New York, not to seat socialist representatives who were elected to state office. And one of the things that occurred to me, and I'd love to hear Forrest, I think this plays to your point about the hunger for domination, the search for power, is what links the 1850s, what links the 1920s, and what links our own time, is it is a time of profound demographic change, a time of profound cultural change. The 1920s, radio becomes a national force. In our state, we had a state legislature that decided to get involved in curricular matters and forbid the teaching of evolution, which led to the Scopes trial in Ray County. The 1920 census was the first time more Americans lived in cities than on farms. You had the rise of the Second Klan after 1915, ferocious anti-immigrant sentiment. A member of the Klan who became the governor of Georgia saying that we should build a wall of steel as high as heaven to keep immigrants from Southern Europe out. All of these, to use Jacob's point, all these illiberal forces, these forces of fear that the world was changing, and therefore those who were in power had to do all they could to hold on to that power.
Right.
That's what this feels like to me. Is that we are in an era where a lot of folks who look like me, right? I'm a white Southern male Episcopalian, right? So a lot of folks who look like me and come from the places I come from think that power is slipping away from us, that there's a demographic reality. And therefore, while we can, we're going to exercise the power that is at hand. Does that resonate for you, Forrest?
Very much so, John. I think you're on point. The pulse of the planet as it relates to the Southern context of the Tennessee Legislature is definitely about the way in which power can be controlled within the cultural ideological frames that best serve their purposes and their sustainability as a dominant force. So media, government, education, economy, religion, even arts and entertainment with the drag show provisions that have been placed in, all of those as it relates to rights for reproduction, about women, all of those areas are places of dominance and control that this kind of cultural dominance seems to be pushing to stay in place when there are forces against it. A new rising diversity, Black, white, Asian, Jewish religious diversity, Christian, Buddhist, all these forces are configuring around a new sense of how democracy can work for all, that this power constraint is not ready to engage. And as I said in my earlier comment about the systemic way in which this masculinity, white male masculinity that's toxic, continues to express itself in these forms of politics and education, trying to censor education, trying to do all the things that eliminate that diversity's sense of expression and rights as it relates to democratic freedoms and rights. And that makes democracy very fragile. It's always messy, democracy is, but it's even more toxic when it is used for these purposes rather than the purpose for which democratic freedoms and communities ought to be shaped around. And that is the most frightening thing to most of us, to me at least, is the way in which democracy has been streved around these issues. And over the last several years, we've seen it shredded in ways that people now distrust that democracy, our government, can pull back together a unity around what justice, democracy, and communities of freedom mean for future generations. And that's the reason why in my little statement I wrote about this is now there is a need for a justice summit for democracy, because justice and democracy must go together, and the freedoms that they offer for people to live in a diverse country as ours, and that we move away from these silos of cultural dominance and perspectives and ideologies continue to divide how these decisions get made, like the Tennessee Assembly made the other day. And the fact that Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, the two African-American males, represent this kind of passion and commitment, even to the point of civil disobedience, like John Lewis and others who have protested in their spaces in government, in culture, that they have been signaled out in this action as in terms of the state legislature, is that we're not going to tolerate that. It breaks House decorum and rules. Over and against, and I think as the comment was made earlier, out of proportion to what the Tennessee Legislature could have used that political capital and energy last week to do and responding to gun controls in this country. So I think that those forces are at work. And I think what now will be necessary is for us to come together and develop a stronger ecosystem of faith and justice advocates with a kind of multi-sector covenant of action that amplifies the voices of Justin Pearson and Justin Jones and Gloria Johnson and the young people that came together to protest against the laws of gun violence here, gun control here in Tennessee. And the interesting thing to me, John, is that Justin Pearson and Justin Jones and Gloria Johnson, they were representing the folk at Covenant Church, the Green Hills suburban community, a population different than their skin color or their cultural kind of connection, because they see these issues as transcending those cultural confines that we have been so used to, race, gender, and so forth. This problem of gun control in this country is affecting Americans everywhere.
Jacob, Bruce is here. I want to get to him in 1 second. But Jacob, give us, is there a global example of a comparative example of a polity that has suffered through the kinds of issues that Forrest is talking about and corrected course?
No, I think all democracies are flawed, and all democracies have flawed histories. And right now, we are engaging in various flawed practices that will be condemned by future generations, at least if we manage to hold on to democracy around the world. So, for all the problems that this country is going through, it is also true that tremendous progress has been made, and that there are practices that fortunately are no longer present. I was just yesterday reading through a sort of a collection of Jim Crow laws that sort of made me it was incredible that these could be adopted by legislatures. Some of those things, and while I certainly won't suggest that all those problems have overcome, there certainly has been progress, and you could say the same in many European countries. Take a country like France, for instance. If you go back to the conflict with the war for Algerian independence, there were protests in the streets of Paris where hundreds of pro-Algerian protesters were killed. They were thrown in the Seine and drowned, and there was it wasn't reported in the media. You had to go until, I think, the 1990s before there was sort of a public acknowledgement of what had actually gone on. And to this day, I don't think anyone actually knows how many people were killed. You could, most countries would not have extended rights to parts of the LGBT community for a very long time. And of course, great irony in that most democracies were born where half the population did not have a right to vote, namely women. So I think there's a lot of inspiration to be had from past movements that have ensured landmark achievements, and that were often viewed as radical at the time. Some of the abolitionists were certainly in this country seen as deeply radical and sort of beyond the pale, even in northern states. And today they're celebrated as national heroes in many places. So yes, there's certainly a lot to be gained from these historical struggles as we go forward. And I remain optimistic, but I think that there will always, I think free speech, democracy are extremely difficult principles to abide by for human beings who are not only committed to principles. We're maybe chiefly committed to feelings of identity and other things where we're able to persuade ourselves that some group is the enemy, that they're eroding the very values and institutions that are essential for who we are, and that will then persuade us that we need to take measures and steps that we would otherwise see as too drastic or draconian. And that, I think, is not limited to Republican conservatives. It's really a human instinct that we have to grapple with always in democracies.
I don't quite get, from a tactical political point of view, not tactical. I understand the tactic. They wanted to punish these folks for allegedly because of what they did. Strategically, though, these are now the most famous state legislators since the first state legislature met, in Samaria. So these are now national figures, and the issue has become magnified by the action. And so to me, it's a fascinating question of, to what extent was this appetite? Was this just to go to Jacob's point, and Forrest, you were making the same point. To what extent was this, we can do this, therefore we will, right? Which begins a human drama that begins in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, right?
Mhm.
You can do it, so you take it no matter what. But in the fullness of time, particularly given that, and I'm not an expert on the details of gun policy. I'm not the expert on the details of any policy, I should stipulate. But where Governor Lee, the governor of Tennessee, has now come out, he has come to, in context, a more forward-leaning position on gun regulation than was true 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And so it's a very interesting political and human drama that's unfolding. And to me, and Forrest, I want you to sort of put on your American Baptist regalia for a second. To me, it's the gun issue, like civil rights. I have thought for a long time that, okay, this is, and forgive the oversimplistic analogy, okay, Columbine is going to be Selma, right? You see what I'm saying? Sandy Hook. Okay, well, wait, that's Selma. That's going to change it, right? Again and again and again. And it hasn't happened.
Right.
And so is there anything from the civil rights experience that suggests what it is within the democratic lowercase d context that both of you have talked about so well that actually does lead to a systemic reform?
Yeah. John, I think, again, how you frame the question and your embellishment of the question as it relates to the civil rights movement and the components of that movement, as James Lawson has been able to point out to us, is that the political calculus of white supremacist systems will always dramatize the need for people to respond nonviolently to change. But the political calculus continues to find camouflage in a state legislature. And I think you're right, the vagrancy laws of Jim Crow get hidden in this House decorum that seemingly was the push for them to punish Justin Jones and Justin Pearson and Gloria Johnson. So what then continuously be the energy behind the appropriate way in which people move their voices to the center of an issue and protest is to call out that system, to call out a system that continues to reconfigure itself in power, control of resources, control of education, and control of how people can feel that they are safe in a way that continues to say to Justin Jones and Pearson and Gloria Johnson and the rest, is that we cannot be silent and will not be silent as long as this system continues to perpetuate a culture of race, gender, and violence, economic segregation, meaning at this time that the wealth gap between the communities that people are experiencing violence every day over and against communities like Columbine and others, where these mass carnages are happening as a result of murder and killing. We've got to find a way to bring the voices of justice and equality and rights and freedom through an ecosystem that combines faith, justice, and human flourishing that our democracy supports, but the democracy itself is being taken over by these voices, by these forces, by these dominant cultures. And throughout, Black African-American people have had to fight that system and try to make democracy the salt of the earth of America. Make democracy what it should be for all people. And that is the great contribution of Justin Jones and Pearson out of the legacy of John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, Martin King, that continues to remind the nation what democracy ought be and how it can sustain this nation in a way wherein the current way in which this calculus is going forward through these supermajorities all across the country, where gerrymandering, the whole thing as it relates to here in Nashville, splitting in half the city council, trying to reconfigure geographical constituencies where that supermajority can remain in place. Those tactics and calculuses will not work because they will continue to rise and push the voices to the forefront. And that is what gives me optimism and hope as it relates to Justin Pearson and Jones and Gloria Johnson and yourself and others around this country are trying to keep pushing to change that calculus. And that's the contribution we can make as a unified ecosystem of voices for justice. That's what I think the civil rights response to it is. And you have to also say that the cultural savvy and of Justin Jones, that cultural savvy of how they presented themselves and their coherent political intelligence and their willingness to lay that before the Tennessee House, they just couldn't handle it, John. They could not see themselves being able to be learning from them rather than punishing them.
Right. So thank you, Forrest. So Bruce is beamed back in from Vulcan.
Allows me to speak once again.
I'm going to ask you, this is the third time I've asked you this question. So I feel like St. Peter here, but this is my third try. What was the supermajority trying to accomplish? Did they accomplish it, or did they inadvertently attract attention to and empower opponents of theirs on the merits of the issue?
Well, I think they did all of those things in part. One, they hoped to have a chilling effect. I'm not sure if that was achieved, but they hoped to have a chilling effect. Second, they hoped to score points with their constituents because most of them come from safe districts and would view the complainants, in this case, the three members who who cooperated with the demonstration in the galleries and used the megaphone. Those people are viewed differently outside of Memphis and Nashville and Knoxville. And so they perhaps scored points with their constituents. Some of them are politically ambitious and see taking hard lines against people who wish to articulate positions that would favor greater control of guns and weaponry as people who should not have the public square in some ways. And part of it's a slap in the face that this particular state legislature has been taking, especially at the city of Nashville, because of the failure of the city council to make a bid for the Republican National Convention in 2024. And that's been going on through a series of actions. So I think there are a whole series of things going on, but I think it was a mistake, and it's a mistake of disproportionality. Mm-hmm. Taking an AR-15 to go squirrel hunting sort of behavior. And I think this disproportionality is increasing in American society in a variety of governmental settings. People don't look at what are the least means to achieve their goals, and they go to a disproportionate response to what's going on. And in this case, it was expulsion when expulsion wasn't called for, and there were lesser means to achieve their goals. They could have had a reprimand, they could have had a censure. In most of these cases, the people who are charged with the violations would at least have a hearing. There was a case where there was just yesterday an expulsion of a legislator in Arizona. But in that situation, the offense occurred 6 or 8 weeks ago. A committee of the legislature was formed to evaluate it. the legislator who did the violation was allowed to make her case with a lawyer, didn't choose to do so all the way, and was expelled, but it was a process, and the nature of the violation was very different. And a majority of Republicans, as well as all the Democrats, voted for the expulsion. So it's a very different sort of thing. We're not used to seeing expulsions as the first course of action to treat violations in legislatures. It's way over the top, and it is in keeping with what's going on in American society generally.
Yeah.
You know, it is going on with our Supreme Court. It used to be the first thing you taught students about the Supreme Court was that it tried to make decisions on the narrowest grounds, not the broadest grounds. And increasingly, we have a Supreme Court that wants to make decisions on the broadest grounds.
Do you think this becomes a model for other states?
Well, I think some of the state legislatures would. At first, I thought there would be a contagion effect, but now I think that that's going to be, at least in the short term, more limited, and that they're going to think twice because they really don't want to get egg on their face. They don't want to look silly. They don't want to lose broader support. They don't want to be seen as a joke on late night television and Saturday Night Live. Mm-hmm. I think all of those things make them think twice about doing this.
Great. Let me ask one or two audience questions, and then I'm going to get your closing thoughts. What, and Bruce, we'll go to you first. Rules were violated. Should the actions be excused? And if not, what actions should have been taken in your view?
Well, I think a more appropriate thing would have been a reprimand of some sort, and saying, you know, this is not in keeping with our rules of decorum. Do not do this again. You know, a slap on the wrist would be appropriate in this case. These were younger members of the legislature, and suggest that if you want to do this, there are other ways of achieving your goal. Right? There are other ways of getting the floor, and maybe we can set something out where you can do that. Right?
Yep. Forrest, this is from someone in the audience. Do you see a parallel between the expulsion that we've seen and Vanderbilt's expulsion of Dr. Lawson in 1962?
Well, they certainly would have similar motivations in terms of responding to the voice of James Lawson and his participation in training students for nonviolent participation in the student sit-in movement, launch counter movement. And it also may have connections with the way Julian Bond in 1966 was not seated in the Georgia State Assembly because of his position on Vietnam. So I think it's more than just this idea of decorum and house rules. It is about a civil way in which voices of opposition can be heard in state houses. Because what happened to Justin Jones and Pearson, their mics were cut off as they sought to speak to issues, not just this one, but in former times in committee or on the floor. The Speaker of the House shut the mic off and don't let them have the full benefit of sharing their voice. So this expulsion as it relates to James Lawson, expulsion from Vanderbilt in terms of his participation in a protest and training people nonviolence has some characteristics in this expulsion. But I think Julian Bond is a great example, a little different, his position on Vietnam that went against the grain of the state of Georgia, and they were not seated and had submitted to the Supreme Court for him to be seated, has some connection, I think, and brings back some sense of how this may work.
Yeah. Jacob, do you have any practical counsel for people in the aftermath of this students, citizens, how to speak out in a way that is, how to practice free speech, I should say, in a way that is productive and not simply provocative?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak as if I live in a fantasy world. And
well, you're an academic, so that's what you do.
Yeah, exactly. That's all I do. But I think, I like Bruce's approach. So, if there's any way to try and not to make this into a partisan issue, where you can say, listen, there are actually these decorum rules. Those decorum rules are there to ensure that all sides can actually speak out and be represented. And it's important that those rules are observed so that important discussions are not drowned out. And then on the other hand, that, this was where these rules may have been broken, but when you have a supermajority and you enforce those rules in a deeply partisan manner, then you also undermine the principle that you seek seek to uphold formally. So if you could have that approach, that might be one way of getting people who might have different views on this together and sort of find a middle ground. Is that possible in the current political environment in this state, in this country? I don't know. I leave that up to people who are much smarter than me, but that could be one way forward.
Thank you. Traditionally, we like to end the Unity Project conversations with this question. So let me ask to each of you. We'll start with Bruce before he disappears on us again. Given the political travails of recent weeks, what, if anything, gives you hope about the future of the state's democratic institutions?
Well, you always hope that the public will take notice and will use the vehicle that is most effective, which is the vehicle of elections. After the 2016 election, one of my colleagues who studied Latin American politics was very concerned that a Trump presidency was the road to what goes on in Latin American dictatorships. And I said, well, Mitch, one very real difference is, thankfully, in the United States, we have very frequent elections. And what you have to remind people about is, if you don't like the outcome, just wait a little while, you can change it. And even when somebody wins office, to put their policies into effect in the American governing system usually takes time and winning multiple majorities and multiple elections, not single elections. So my faith in the system is that the public will tire of some level of polarization and punish actors who go to the extremes and who act disproportionately to what's going on.
Jacob, what do you think? What gives you hope?
Well, I've only lived in this great state for 3 weeks, so this is. But
it's
so
all. It's always like this.
Yeah. So what I'll say is that, and I think that's maybe true also in terms of national politics, is that when you zoom away from social media and the news coverage, and when I speak to ordinary people in this state and around the city, it seems to me, not only are people some of the kindest people that I've ever met, but there's also sort of a critical mass of people who have sort of what I'd call common sense, and who are perhaps not as invested as those who are sort of performatively engaged in this ritualization of polarization. So that would be my hope, that there's a sufficiently critical mass of people with ordinary common sense who are not deeply partisan, and who will come together and if not muddle through, then muddle through in the short term and make progress in the long term. That would be my hope.
Forrest?
Yeah, my hope is similar. My hope is built on nothing less than what was just said. Creating a system of justice against the systems that bring ruin or possible ruin to what we call our democracy. I have hope in the Justin Jones, the Justin Pearsons, the Gloria Johnson, the diversity of people who have common sense and have a deep sense for what civility can mean, and they are not willing to give up on that, even in the midst of the brokenness and pain of our country. We are a broken country. We are broken people. We all are now paranoid somewhat about when the next violent episode will happen. How close will it come to home, and who will and how it will affect our families. In the midst of that sense of pessimism and not knowing, the hope that is brightest, I think, today is when things are meant for evil, God means them for good. And when this good continues to surface and rise up in the voices of young people like Justin and Johnson, when it keeps rising up in the efforts that we do institutionally at universities, at my college, when it continues to rise up at the valleys and the struggles in the valleys of people, common people, lay people who just don't have any response to it other than the pain and brokenness, I think that hope is vibrant and alive in the darkest moments of our country. And last month, this last 2 weeks have been dark days for Nashville, dark days for Tennessee. But it has pushed Governor Lee to rethink how he might, as governor, respond to the issue of gun control, and has pushed others to be more involved in the process so that we can move and have transformation for our communities. So that's my response to that. I always have to be a prisoner of hope.
And let the people say amen. Thank you all. Thanks to the three of you. Thanks to the Project on Unity and American Democracy, to Gray Sasser and his wonderful folks. Thank you all, and watch this space. We're not going anywhere, and we appreciate your time, your attention, your support. Thank you all.